Okay, well I think it's time to start addressing the issue of mist. So, have a few airbrushed mist layers that I've created. Basically just taking some of them, eyedropping some of the mist colors from down below in the waterfalls and using a big soft airbrush. And on one layer, brush around a bunch of mist and then just duplicate that layer and slide it around and try and get a nice coverage for the tree line and the palace there itself. So we also need to find a solution for these waterfalls. The concept art had more waterfalls than what we see here, so I'm going to duplicate these falls over and flip them horizontally, scale them down a little bit, try and see if we can use something back up in there on the left side of the canyon. Just clean up the edges. Overall, if we scale it a little bit horizontally so it becomes skinnier, it'll help to make it look quite a bit different from the original photo. Again, these are just guidelines for the positioning of the CG waterfalls later on. We do want to try and get the falls to look quite realistic and set in there. Even though there's subtle variations in values with the falls versus the rocks because of all the haze, nonetheless, it is quite complex. From the data from the photograph is complex enough that I'd rather not paint it all in there. I really want to take full advantage of the photographic reference. So again, I'm just brush stroking in at the same angle that the sun might be coming down. Some more haze. And try and get a nice line for the tops of the falls. So the water basically ends and then the falls start. That makes a lot more sense. We don't really want that soft edge, that airbrushy edge. If you have too much of that airbrushy edge, it tends to look more like a sloppy photo montage. So I'm just selecting some of the waterfall colors there. I selected it from below the curves, turned everything off, including the curve, selected that light blue color that the waterfalls are, and now on a separate layer I can paint with that color because I'm still below the curves within our falls group, within the falls folder there in the layer stack. Now I can go in and I can play around with some light blue paint and try and just illustrate the lay of the land back in there. I want to have a little bit larger falls, and I don't want it to just be a flat lake top that falls down a couple 100 feet. I want it to have a little bit of 1 foot, 2 foot falls here and there at the top. Just places where it feels like the water is very shallow. The lake has kind of come to an end and hit a lot of terrain. It's worn down the terrain through the years, and it hasn't worn the terrain evenly. So I'm just going to continue sketching, try and get several layers of falls back in there. See if I can come up with a nice massing, something that complements the composition. So as we zoom out, we can see the relationship of the falls I just painted. I think that the left side of the falls there needs to be darkened down a little bit. It's a little bit too bright for the sun angle. So we'll trace the sun angle. Feather it a little bit, and then darken it down. That way the falls kind of disappear a little bit behind that cliff. Next we'll just go in and detail a little bit, just so that we have a little bit better sense of scale. I want the falls to feel like fingers, you know, streaking over top of the rocks. And since right there beside us on the left we can see the vegetation, there's a direct correlation to the scale that's happening there. So we don't want the scale, we don't want the waterfalls to appear too big and brushy. Just a little bit of detail will help us, will help guide us when we go to put in the CG waterfalls. Green colors from the cliffside, the cliff tops. And I don't want them to be contaminated by that magenta that we have set in the curves. So while I'm at it, just like I did on the right side with the layers in the waterfalls, over here on the left I want to suggest that there's a few more little tiny islands with, you know, rocks sticking up with greenery growing on them. I'm just going to go in there and clean up their edges a little bit. I did clone them with a fatter brush, so couldn't really clone details in there. Going to try and blend this rock into the little bit of the canyon back there. Some of these are feeling a little bit too tall for this perspective, so I'm just going to shrink them down. So same thing, just turn off the color curves. That way now when we select paint, select colors, or select areas to clone, we have accurate values. I'm trying to just clone the Now as you sit back and look at the whole painting, it looks like at the top we have a little bit of a grain issue in the sky. Now luckily the sky is pretty much just a flat a gradation of color. So what I'm going to do is duplicate that sky layer. And I'm going to call it a degrain. Technically this is just a blurred segment. But if I go in there, I can blur that part. We're not losing any detail just because it's a large grad. And if we blur it enough, the grain will virtually disappear. Again, keeping in mind that the final output is 50% for this painting. That's the before and after. So, pretty significant difference. And if we want to take the time to make that grad up in the sky absolutely perfect, certainly we could do that, but at this point in time, I'm not too worried about it. We can take a look at the difference in blur, sharp versus blur, and it's a good point that we don't want to blur things that have sharp edges. Just reiterating the fact that we have that soft grad up in the sky, so blurring the grain out was acceptable.